Okay, it is episode 5 of the series on rhetoric, Strategery. A reminder, I will be pulling all kinds of references out of James Baldwin's letter to his nephew, sometimes called My Dungeon Shook. It's been the mentor text for this whole series, and it is, as it has been in every episode, the first link down below in the show notes. So if you haven't read it, scroll down there and click on it and read it. It's really good, and I'll see you right after the theme song. Okay, a quick recap of where we are, bring everybody up to speed. We've been talking about rhetoric, which is the set of tools that writers and speakers have to make their arguments more persuasive, to make them sound more convincing. And we've talked about how writers and speakers need to be aware of the rhetorical situation. They need to make appeals to their own credibility or ethos appeals. They need to manipulate their readers' and listeners' emotions. That's the pathos appeals. And they need to make sure that they have evidence and a logical case connecting that evidence to their claim. Those are logos appeals. That was the previous 4 episodes. But not everything that gets called a rhetorical device has anything to do with the appeals. A lot of rhetorical devices are really more about style. You know what? Give me a second. Okay, I'm back with an analogy. Let's pretend that your argument, let's imagine that it's a candy bar, right? And you could wrap up your candy bar like this, shiny with a logo in a pretty font and in a way that would really make people want your argument. Or, you could present your argument kind of like this, just a plain wrapper with vaguely close to the name of it on there. Which candy bar are people going to buy? Obviously, they're going to buy this one. They're going to look at this one and think, that's where the razor blades are. Rhetorical devices are kind of the same way. You can have the best argument in the world, and if your style is poor, if your use of language is poor, nobody is going to buy your argument. So I want to talk in this episode about 3 other areas that you can focus on, 3 other sets of strategies. We're going to talk about the structure of your argument. We're going to talk about the syntax that you use, and we're going to talk about your diction. And we're going to start with structure. Structure refers to the way an author constructs a complete text, looking at the whole thing from top to bottom, beginning to end. How is that put together? And Baldwin has obviously chosen to structure his letter to his nephew as, it's going to blow your mind for a second, a letter. There are some obvious advantages to that. And I talked about some of these a little bit in previous episodes when how I talked about how they affect his ethos appeals and how they affect his pathos appeals. Definitely writing it as a letter gives Baldwin some advantages. One of those is that he has a sort of declared intended audience, which is his nephew, James. Now, as I said previously, he did not write this letter, type it up, put it into an envelope, hand it to his nephew James and say, here, read it, and then, eat it. Don't let anybody else ever see it. No, Baldwin chose to publish this in the Progressive magazine. He had an audience in mind who was not his nephew James, but by talking to his nephew James in a one-to-one kind of affiliative relationship, calling him baby, calling him old buddy, calling him dear friend, it disarms the readers who are not his nephew James. Oh, he's not writing this thing about me, the white middle-class readers of the Progressive magazine in 1962 would say. No, he's writing this to his nephew. It doesn't have anything to do with me. And then, disarmed, they will go into the text, and when Baldwin talks about the conditions that his nephew James was born into, the white readers of the Progressive magazine can be like, whoa, I didn't realize that Harlem in 1962 looks just like London in 1862. So the letter structure works well for Baldwin in this case. Another structure that people often don't think about in terms of something to use for an argument is the narrative. It's the story. And so if you're writing, you might want to consider trying to write a narrative as an argument, or you should not be surprised when you're asked to analyze something and it's kind of structured as a story, but it's being treated as an argument. And the reason is because human beings love stories. We love patterns. Our brains evolved to see patterns and to look for patterns. That's why you can go to the internet and you can type pretty much anything on a tree, like Virgin Mary on a tree. People have seen it. People see Jesus in a dog's butt, or like Che Guevara on a t-shirt, right? Obviously none of those are real. It's not a miracle. It's just our ability as humans to see the pattern. So think about using a narrative structure, or think about how when you're reading a narrative, the author has deliberately selected that as a way to put forward the ideas that they're trying to get across. So besides letter and narrative and your classical argument and an inductive argument, you've also got things like a process structure. So a process essay is step-by-step instructions for how to do something. You can have definition essays where you're trying to say this thing means this. You can have arguments of policy, like I think we ought to be doing X, Y, and Z. You can do cause and effect. You can do comparison, contrast. Classification, like, hey, here's a bunch of things I'm looking at, and this is where I think they fit in categories that we can all agree on. Any of those structures is perfectly appropriate, and I don't want you to spend the rest of your writing life thinking that you've only got the option of a 5-paragraph essay. There is so much more out there, and that's why I'm calling this Strategery, because it really is about you as a writer picking the strategy that is going to work best for your individual argument. Now, hashtag warning, it's been a while since I've done one of those, but I even forget the hand gesture. But if your teacher says, you must write a 5-paragraph essay and I will accept no tomfoolery, young sir or young madam, no tomfoolery. Okay, obviously you have to play that game, but just recognize that that's an artificial restriction on your choices when it comes to structure. One final note on structure. If you are doing an analysis, in the same way that you would never say an author uses ethos, you never say an author uses structure. Every author uses structure. Every text that you read has a structure. So you kind of need an adjective before the word structure. This author uses a narrative structure. This author uses a process structure, a cause and effect structure. That is how you want to talk about structure if you're doing an analysis. The next category of strategies that you as a writer can choose, or that writers you're analyzing have chosen from, is syntax. And no, I'm not talking about an extra 0.5% on alcohol sales, although that is a sin tax. I'm talking about syntax with the Y, where syntax refers to the arrangement of words into sentences, basically sentence structure. And you can remember this because even though they're spelled differently, syntax and sentence start with the same sound. The most basic level of choice you get when you're talking syntax is choosing from among the 4 sentence types. I covered a couple of these way back in series number 1 on sentences. Series number 6, which will be dropping soon, is also about sentences, where I get into the other 2 of these. But your basic sentence structures are simple sentences, which if you go back to series 2, you learn they don't have to be that simple. You got your compound sentences, where there are 2 independent clauses or more. You've got your complex sentences, where you have 1 main or independent clause and you have 1 or more subordinate or dependent clauses. And then of course the compound complex, where you have both the compound sentence, meaning 2 or more independent clauses, and the complex part, which is 1 or more additional subordinate clauses or dependent clauses. That sounds like a lot of stuff to try to keep straight, and it is, right? And 98% of the time, writers, and I'm saying this as a writer and somebody who studies writers and talks to writers, maybe 95% of the time, authors are not consciously thinking about every single sentence. This one should be complex. This one should be compound. Oh, I want a compound. But authors do think about the best way to get information from the page to you. And if they need to talk about more than one idea in a single sentence, they're going to go to the compound sentence. If they need to talk about how one thing depends on another, they're going to go to the complex sentence. And even if they're not thinking about it consciously, they know, because they practice, because they think about these things. They know that that sentence structure is the best thing to use for that particular idea. Let me point you to a couple of things that James Baldwin does. And we're going to start in the first paragraph. Take a look at these first two sentences. I have begun this letter 5 times and torn it up 5 times. Sure, there are 2 verbs, begun and torn, but there's a single subject. So that very first sentence is a very straightforward, simple sentence. Look at the next one. I keep seeing your face, which is also the face of your father and my brother. That's a complex sentence. We've got the I keep seeing your face. There's your independent clause. You could put a period right there after face. You'd have a complete sentence. It would be fine. But then he's got the subordinated conjunction which. And so he brings in that additional information that this face that his nephew James has looks just like his father's face. And, that's, of course, James Baldwin's the elders. James Baldwin, his brother. So that nice little jump from the simple sentence to the complex sentence. Here's a very basic fact about me writing this letter to here's a slightly more complicated fact about the way I am approaching this letter. That's a nice bit there. Let's skip to paragraph 4 for a second. I hear the chorus of the innocent screaming, "No, this is not true. How bare you are." But I am writing this letter to you to try to tell you something about how to handle them, for most of them do not yet really know that you exist. It's a compound sentence, though. If you leave out the part that's in quotation marks, where he's attributing some words to his critics, it's some independent clauses joined between the first and the second by the fanboy word but, and between the second and the third by the fanboy word for. And the reason why Baldwin wants to go to a compound sentence there, and I wasn't there when he wrote it, I'm not in his head now, I'm not a medium, I'm not communicating with his spirit, ghosts are not real, but looking at it as somebody who could analyze this text, he goes to the compound sentence there because there is this sense of building one thing upon another that is important for James to know, the nephew James, about the context of this letter. And hey, let's go ahead and skip back to paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 is exactly 2 sentences long. Yeah, sure, one of them is 75 words and the other one is 61 words, give or take, but it's only 2 sentences. But those sentences are compound, complex sentences. And I'm not going to read them to you because they're long, and it was on your screen for a while, and you have the link, you could read it. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that it's paragraph 3 where he really lays out his main idea, his claim, the thing that he really wants to get across, not just to his nephew James, but to his readers in the Progressive magazine, which is that, there are all these white people who think that they are innocent, but in fact that they are not, and whether they have been actively trying to do it or just silently complicit while it was happening, thousands and thousands of lives are being destroyed. Because that paragraph conveys very complicated ideas, lots of moving parts that have to come together to make this claim, Baldwin uses the compound complex, by far the most convoluted of the possible sentence structures that you could use. And he does it because he needs to be able to say, this is true and this is true because this is true. He needs to be able to show that complex relationship between and among the things that he is talking about. One more thing, as long as we're talking about sentence types, if you jump over to paragraph 6, I'm not going to read that one to you either, but it's the one with all the yous, right? You were born, you were told, all that. And even though there's a lot of repetition in that paragraph, Baldwin does it by using a bunch of different sentence types. So it's not compound sentence, compound sentence, compound sentence, compound sentence. you've fallen asleep because every sentence sounds the same. He's keeping the sentences varied in terms of their length and their structure, because if he didn't, the other repetition in the paragraph would kill the meaning of that paragraph. He has to pay attention not just to the message of the paragraph, but also to the style to make sure that the people who read it actually read it. One amazing thing about this text is that Baldwin writes no questions. But that doesn't mean that you, as a writer, shouldn't be thinking about how to effectively use questions in an argument that you are writing. You can use rhetorical questions. For example, in a rhetorical question, a lot of people think, oh, a rhetorical question is a question that doesn't have an answer. That's not what it is. It's not that it doesn't have an answer. It's that the question itself is an argument. When somebody says to you, hey, how did you get to be so stupid? They're just calling you stupid. They do not actually want you to answer with, you know, you fell on your head as a baby and you huffed too much glue in middle school. They don't want to know that. They're just calling you stupid. That's a rhetorical question. There are some other things. There's what I like to call the Donald Rumsfeld style of speaking, where you ask a question and immediately answer it. Is this a good thing to do in your essays? Of course. Should you do it all the time? No, because that starts to get boring. Another syntactical thing that is really important is called parallelism, or parallel structure. And the most basic definition of that is when you're saying the same kind of thing, you should use the exact same grammatical structure. And if you think back to that paragraph 6 that has all the yous, you were born, you were told, there's a lot of literal repetition of words, but there's also a repetition of structure, that there's somebody out there who's telling you this thing because of this other thing. But for a better example, or a more clear example, maybe take a look at paragraph 11. It'll be hard, James, but you come from sturdy peasant stock, men who picked cotton, dammed rivers, built railroads, and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds, achieved an unassailable and monumental dignity. He's collapsing a whole lot of American history into a single sentence there, but he does it through this series, this list, where every item in the list begins with a strong active past tense verb. That's parallelism. He is setting up the same grammatical structure, an active past tense verb, to say similar things or get across similar ideas. Parallelism is a kind of pattern making. And remember that we human beings, we like patterns. So you, as an author, you need to be careful that if you set up a pattern, you're using past tense verb, past tense verb, past tense verb, that the fourth verb in that list had better be past tense, because your readers are going to notice when you've blown the pattern. And before we move on to diction, same warning, same reminder, do not say a writer uses syntax. Every writer uses syntax. You use syntax. You use syntax when you are texting with your friends, even if you're not texting real words. Emojis have syntax. It's a thing. People study it now. Instead, you want to use an adjective. There is a complex syntax. There is simple syntax. Repetition is a syntactical choice, and you don't even need to say the word syntax or any other complicated word to talk about the repetition in a text that you are analyzing. And that brings us to our final topic of this series, which is an author's diction. Diction refers to a particular author's particular choice of words. It's kind of amazing that you can write, maybe not you, but people, I certainly can't, that someone can write a computer program that can analyze an anonymous or nameless text, compare it to the texts of known authors, and then say, hey, this anonymous text was actually written by this guy. You can go back to the plays of Shakespeare that we know he co-wrote, plays like Cardenio, and you can see, all right, Shakespeare definitely wrote these sections because the words that he uses here are very, 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 very similar to the words that he uses in the plays that we know 100% he was the author of. I'm going to put up a diagram here, well, 3 diagrams, because you can think about diction along a few different continuums. You've got your formal versus informal continuum. When a writer is writing, are they using the fancy words, or are they using the down home folksy words, the colloquialisms, if you will? There's the concrete to abstract continuum. Concrete being very real and solid sensory detail to help you picture a thing or hear what is being described, or even like you're reading a cookbook or something, you can smell because there's sensory detail in the descriptions. That's concrete. Abstract is really more about ideas. Like if you're talking about capitalism or faith, you're going to use a lot of abstract diction because there aren't concrete things really to talk about to go with those. And then finally, you've got the biased to neutral. And that's actually, biased against, neutral, and then biased for, because you could use diction that is very, very neutral, where you adjust the facts, just as many facts as I can put out there, and I'm not judging these facts. Or you can say, hey, here's this awesome thing, and then you're biased for, and you can say, oh my goodness, we need to talk about what is going on over here because this is terrible, and you're biased against. What about Baldwin's text, his letter to his nephew? Well, Baldwin uses very, very formal diction, and even though he refers to his nephew as baby and dear James and my dear namesake, stuff like that, that's kind of cute. But when you look at the totality of this text, it's very well. Okay, here's a giveaway. Baldwin does not use a single contraction in this text. There is no place in this letter to his nephew where he says wasn't, or you'll, or it's with the apostrophe s. He would say it is, and that, as I said, it should be a big fat flashing light that, hey, this is an author who is trying to be very formal in his choice of words. It is also pretty abstract. I mean, he's talking about things like racial identity and the way that the white man feels when he sees the black man rising, so that comparatively the white man is not quite where he thought he was, even though he hasn't necessarily moved. So it's a fairly abstract text. But in terms of the bias, again, I think that Baldwin is nearer to the neutral, although he definitely is negative about the white man, because history. When you're analyzing, you definitely want to be able to talk about some examples of the diction that shows formality or informality, stuff like that. And when you're writing, you definitely want to think, okay, who is my audience? What is my claim? How should I be speaking to them? Are they going to be most moved by a very informal style if I'm using a lot of slang and colloquialisms? Or are they going to be moved by my formality if I eliminate the contractions and I use the $40 word when, other people would just use the $5 word? You've got to think about those things as you write. So that's one way to look at diction. But diction isn't just limited to those three things. You've got things like hyperbole, where you're over-exaggerating something, or you've got understatement, and there are actually two kinds of understatement. You've got your litotes, which is where you say something is not the opposite of what it actually is, like Michael Jordan was not a bad basketball player. That's litotes. There's also meiosis, which is where you try to make something seem smaller than it is. That's another kind of understatement where you might say, Jimi Hendrix played a little guitar. Those are examples of understatement. Now, those things tend to create a sense of informality, hyperbole, and understatement. So I think that you would hopefully just nod in agreement when I say that's a good reason why Baldwin doesn't include any examples of those in his text. And in fact, not only does Baldwin not use any hyperbole, he takes the phrase or the clause, you exaggerate, and he puts that into the mouth of the white man and explicitly denies exaggerating. There are other aspects to diction, like you can play with the sound of words. Think about the words that you're using and do they sound good together. There are things like assonance, which would be repetition of vowel sounds within words in a row or near each other. There's consonants, which is repetition of consonant sounds within words that are near each other, and perhaps the slightly more familiar one to you, which is alliteration. Alliteration is where there's a repetition of sound at the beginning of words, and if you do too much of that, you can start to have a bit of a sing-songy kind of thing. And I talked in our episode about pathos appeals about bringing music to the writing, but you want to be careful because too much of the sing-songiness and you're playing too much with the sound of the words can push you towards the informal. And that's why Baldwin, because he's going for this formal diction and this formal tone, he alliterates. He absolutely does, but he does it in kind of respectable small doses. There's father's face in paragraph 2. There's also most of mankind in paragraph 3, or white man's world in paragraph 9. And I know I did talk about this back in the episode on pathos appeals. Also in paragraph 3, there are a lot of these negative sounding D words. So there's some alliteration that way. And that by far is the heaviest concentration of alliteration. Most of the rest of what Baldwin does is in those little, 2 or 3 word phrases where he would get a repetition a couple of times. Again, because he's trying to maintain a more formal tone. Last thing on diction, just like with syntax, just like with structure, just like with all of the appeals, you don't say the author uses diction. Every author uses diction. You need an adjective. The author uses formal diction. The author uses neutral diction. And you can even leave out the word diction, just like you can with syntax and with structure. And that brings us now to the end of Series 5. I want to show you one more thing, one last little thing. This is my copy of the text, My Dungeon Shook, James Baldwin's letter to his nephew. Now, obviously, I have just spent weeks of my life putting together 5 episodes of an internet TV show that probably nobody's going to watch, and talking about this text. So I have spent a lot of time with it, and yes, I'm going to mark it up. But it is a good time to pause and remember that when you are doing analysis, you do have to mark up a text. You should be annotating. You should be making notes and writing these things down. Back during the episode, I mentioned that the next series is going to be the second series on sentences, where we'll talk about some of the more advanced syntactical things and get into those a little bit more in depth. So I'm really kind of excited to put that together, and I hope to see you there, because I'm sure I will see you for the next one. Cat is out there, and he's unhappy.